All right, hello. We're going to go ahead and go over the homework assignment from 2.8. So this week we learned about various string methods that we can call on string objects to do certain actions. Last time during class we actually got started on the first exercise. We did 2.8.6 where we created the talker class. So I'm going to go ahead and start on 2.8.7. If you need to watch the implementation for the previous assignment, that will be in the previous Zoom recording. All right, so for this assignment, we have to implement a toString method. And so a toString method is a very specific type of method that has to be in this form. So it has to have this method signature. It has to be public, it has to return a string, and the method, of course, has to be called toString, and then it doesn't take any arguments in between the parentheses here. So what we need to determine is what string do we need to return? What's the form of that string that we need to return? So they actually tell us that our toString method should be formatted so that if we create an object of the flower class that have these values, when we try to print out that object, it should print out in this format. So let's go ahead and explore the flower class to see what these values correspond to. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the flower class, and I can see right away that I have 4 private instance variables, and all 4 of them are strings. So I'm going to go ahead and just label these as my private instance variables. I see that I have a string that corresponds to a name of the flower, the color of the flower, the genus, and the species. And then down here, we can see this is the constructor that initializes all 4 of our private instance variables. So this is our constructor. What we have to do now is implement the string method. So this is going to return some string. And what is the format of that? Let's go back to the assignment to find out. So we can see that for an object that's declared or instantiated with the values foxglove, red, digitalis, and obscura, we need to be able to return the string to look like this. So in other words, let's go ahead and actually just copy this as an example. So example, if we have a flower object with these values, so I'm going to go ahead and comment that out. When we print it out, foxglove, which is the name of our object here, we should see this. So what I want to do, why I copied this over in a comment, is I want to find out what do each of these strings correspond to? What private instance variables? Because I can just use those variables instead of actually like typing a string literal here. So it looks like red gets passed in as the second parameter here. So it looks like red corresponds to the color, which gets passed to color. So I know that I want to, so we need to return the following string. We need to return first color, so color, and then we'll need a space in between color and the next part of the string, right? Because if we look right here, we've got color, which is in this case red, a space, and then this next value comes from this argument here, which is the first argument, and that corresponds to the name, which gets passed into this private instance variable, which is name. So we're going to go ahead and put name there. And then let's see what we got. We got another space and a parenthesis. So I'm going to go ahead and put, as a string literal, I'm going to put a space and open parentheses, only open parentheses. The next part is digitalis, which is my third parameter being passed in, and that corresponds to the genus, or the genus, and that gets passed over to genus. So I'm going to go ahead and put genus next. And if I look at my string here, I notice that I also have a space between the genus and the next part. So I'm going to go ahead and put that as a string literal. So there's my space. The next part of the string is obscura, which is my fourth parameter, which gets passed as the species. And that is used to initialize species. So I know that the next part of the string should be species. Very last part is to go ahead and also print out a closing parenthesis. So I'm going to go ahead and put that as a string literal. And then we can actually use this exact format in our toString. So I'm going to go ahead and replace this empty string with what I kind of outlined right here. I'm just going to paste that in. So now I'm returning a concatenated string, and that concatenated string is comprised of reference variables that point to strings and string literals like spaces and the parentheses. So this should now actually return a string that is in this format, and we can go ahead and test that out. So now I'm going to go over to the test class, which is written for us. And you can see that they actually instantiate the object for us that is exactly like the one in the example in the assignment text. So hopefully, when I print this out, I will get the right format. And to remind ourselves, that format is like this. I'm going to add that as a comment here so that we can compare when we run it. So let's expand this out, go over to run code, and run it, and we should get this as a result, and we do. So now we're going to go ahead and click check code so it can run more tests on different values that are passed in, and it should execute for different examples. Awesome. All right, so now let's go ahead and move on to the next one. You can go ahead and click on submit and continue. The next example or exercise is called organizing files. So in this example, we have the class filer. And in filer, the purpose is to help organize files by determining if the instance variable word comes before, after, or is the same as, is equal to another word. So in this class, we're going to have these three methods, and they're already started for us. We just have to fill in the code. So we have to implement comes before, comes after, and is equals. And our objective is to utilize the methods compared to and equals that are covered in this section. They're also reminding us that a Boolean is a true or false value because we are going to have to use Booleans to see if two strings are equal or if something is negative or positive. So let's go ahead and start this. So they've created a tester class for us that will evaluate whether or not our methods are working. Our purpose is to go ahead and go to the filer class and explore. So let me actually reset this. Okay, so when we get here, we'll see that we do have a private instance variable called word that is a string object. we do have a constructor that initializes that private instance variable with a string that's passed in here. So here's our constructor. And we have a getter, which is also called an accessor method, that returns that specific word. And we can use this to access this string from the tester class. What we need to do now is implement the next three methods. So for comes before, we need to determine if the word, so this variable here, comes before some other word that gets passed in. And if you remember from when we covered it in class, we can use the method that is called compare to. And we can go ahead and remind ourselves how that actually works by opening up our quick reference. So here's the compare to method. And remember that if it returns a value that's less than 0, a negative number, that means that the calling string comes before the string that we pass in here as other in the dictionary. If it's 0, it means that they're the same. And if it returns a value that's greater than 0, a positive number, it means that the calling string is coming after this other string that we're passing in the dictionary. So we're going to use that knowledge to go ahead and implement actually two of these methods, because there's actually a different way to check for equality. So let's go ahead and do comes before. So I'm going to write as a note to myself, check if word is less than the other word. Okay, so how do we want to do that? We want to say word dot compare to, and then we're going to pass in this other word. Okay, so if word is less than other word, it means that word comes before this other word. So let's say that what I'm actually passing in is apple and then compare to zebra. Right, so we can actually write it that way too. So in this case, apple is less than zebra, because when we compare these things numerically, we see that A comes before Z in the alphabet. Okay, so calling this will actually give us a number, right? So if we have something like this, where we're actually calling compare to on a string like apple, and we're comparing it to zebra, what we would expect to get is a number that is less than 0. So what we want to do is we actually want to store this as a Boolean. And what we want to do is we want to check to see if the return value of this method is less than 0. Okay. And so this will be true if the string that is calling compare to, so this word, is coming before this string, other word, in the dictionary. It'll return false if if word comes after other word. Okay, so the last step now is to just return the result. We could actually also just return this all in one line. So as an alternative, we could do this in one line. We could say return the result of the statement. That's an alternative. But sometimes I like to break this up into multiple steps just because it kind of clarifies what's happening, especially for beginning programmers. So you could do it either way. Down here, comes after is going to be almost the same thing. So I'm going to copy this, paste it. But now I'm checking to see if word comes after other word. So if it does, that means that the result of calling compare to is going to be a positive number, because this word will have a greater numeric value than the word that we're passing in as an argument. So we just change the sign here. For equal is equal, we can use compare to and check to see if the result is equal to 0, but we don't have to. We have actually another method here called equals. And equals is going to return a Boolean value. It's going to return true if the calling string is the same, like identical string as the argument string, or it'll return false if they are not identical. So we're going to use this method instead. So in this case, I'm going to say return, and then remember the two things that we're comparing is the private instance variable word and other word here. So I'm going to say word, and I'm going to use that to call equals. And then as my argument, I'm going to pass in other word. So again, this is going to return true if word and other word are the same string. And then it's going to return false if they are not the same. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and, actually we already have the comments here. So, all right, so let's go ahead and test this out. So we've got a lot of code going on in the file tester class. And basically it's just going to test comparing different words together, like hippo and zebra, and hippo with an uppercase H. And it'll also enable us to add in our own words as well through the scanner class. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, so you can see that, the automated tests kind of come back accurately, where hippo actually comes before zebra in the dictionary and it says true. And hippo comes after zebra, false. Hippo is equal to zebra, false. And then notice also that uppercase is different than lowercase. So capitalization matters. It says hippo comes before hippo with a capital H, false. That's because uppercase letters on your computer actually have a smaller numeric value than lowercase if we look at our ASCII chart. So if we look at this real quick, we can see that the uppercase values have smaller numerical values than our lowercase. So you kind of have to remember that the uppercase comes before lowercase on a computer. And then, the lowercase version is not equal to the uppercase version. So let's go ahead and test out our equals method. So let's put in two strings that are the same, like apple and then apple. And I think I might have waited too long to do that, so let's rerun that. All right, so apple. Oh, this is to compare to hippo, so let's go ahead and just put hippo in again. Okay. So now you can see when we check to see if hippo is equal to hippo, it is indeed true. All right. So let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and submit that, and we'll continue on with concatenating fractions. And so for this one, they give us a partial implementation of a fraction class, and we have to implement two different methods, get numerator and get denominator. And then we also have to implement the Tostring method so that it returns a string for the fraction class in the form numerator over denominator, such as 1 over 2 or 16 over 20. And then we have to test our code in the fraction tester class. So let's actually just ignore this stuff for now, and let's just tackle this first part. So the fraction class. So I'm going to go over and I'm going to reset my history. All right, so my fraction class has two private instance variables. And there are two integers, one for the numerator, the number on top, and one for the denominator, which is the number on the bottom. It's got a constructor already, which initializes my numerator and denominator with two integers that are passed in. And what I have to do is I need to implement these three methods. I need to implement the get numerator, which is an accessor or a getter. And all that does is it returns an integer. And that integer is going to be our numerator, the private instance variable. So this is actually a pretty easy thing. All we have to do is say return and then the name of the private instance variable we want to return. So return numerator. And then down here, we're going to do something very similar. This time we want to return the denominator. So we're going to say return denominator. All right. Last thing we want to do is implement a toString method. So in this case, we want to return a string representing a fraction in the form of numerator over denominator. So I want to start this out as return. Rather than, putting in a string literal that has, a numerator in there, I want to actually return the value of the numerator as the private instance variable. And then I also need this character here, this slash. So I'm going to concatenate that as a string literal. And then I also need to concatenate after that slash the value of the private instance variable called denominator. And that's all you have to do to finish implementing the fraction class. So let's take a look at what we need to do in the tester. So it looks like the first thing is to create objects. So let's get some more specific information here. It says that I need to create a fraction that represents 1 over 2, 1/2. So how am I going to do that? Well, let's look at the constructor. It looks like I just need to call the constructor, which is named fraction, and then pass in a numerator, which in this case would be 1, and then a denominator, which in this case would be 2. So let's go ahead and do that. So to create an object, I need to put the name of the class, fraction, give it a name, I'll call it my fraction, and then call the constructor. So that takes the form of new, and then fraction, and then pass in values to initialize the private instance variables. So remember, it's the numerator and then the denominator. Since I want 1/2, I'm going to put 1 for the numerator, 2 for the denominator. All right, so now I've created this fraction, basically. All right, so next thing I want to do is now I want to ask the user for a numerator and denominator and create a fraction object out of that. So we're going to go ahead and do that here where it says ask for input. We already have a scanner object created, so I'm going to use the scanner object to do this. So first I want to prompt the user. So I'm going to say system.out.println, and I want to ask them to enter a numerator. Okay, and then I'm going to get that number, which is going to be an integer, right? Because we're not asking for a fraction, we're asking for the numerator and denominator separately to create a fraction object. So to get an integer, to store an integer, let's go ahead and create an int. We can call it just num. And then to get that out of user input, we're going to reference our scanner object, which is called input dot. And then the method we want to call is nextInt to get the integer out of user input. And now we want to prompt the user one more time, this time for the denominator. So we're going to ask them to enter a denominator. And then we're going to do a similar thing where we're going to create another integer variable. I'll just call it den for denominator. And again, we're going to get the next integer from user input. All right, so now that we've gotten the numerator and denominator, we want to create a new fraction object with the user's input. So it's going to take a similar form as this right here. I'll go ahead and copy and paste that. But instead of putting in just hard-coded values here, 1 and 2, I want to use what the user put in for the numerator for the first argument. And then for the second argument, I want to pass in what the user put in for their denominator. So that's going to create an object, a fraction that is numerator over denominator, whatever those values are. Okay, so now that I have those two fraction objects, I want to add them together. And I'm not just going to say, fraction plus fraction. I'm going to use this, this equation right here. So it says that if a fraction is of the form a over b plus c over d, it's the same thing as multiplying the numerator of the first fraction times the denominator of the second plus multiplying the denominator of the first fraction and the numerator of the second fraction all over the denominators of both fractions multiplied. So we're just going to go ahead and copy that in a comment. So I'm going to go ahead and put that right here. So in this case, I want to first calculate the numerator. So just this part right here. So I'm going to say numerator is this, and then the denominator is this part. So now I can kind of isolate those two and kind of like break it down into steps that are more easily managed. Okay, so both of these things are going to be integers. So I'm going to go ahead and declare an integer called result num. So that's when I add the two things together, the two numerators together. So now I want to actually take this part of the equation, but instead of putting A, B, C, and D, I want to take the values that actually match up in my fractions. So let's see, A right here is the numerator of the first fraction. So in mine, that's going to be my fraction's numerator. Now notice that in this comment it says make use of get denominator and get numerator. These getters will actually get, it'll get the denominator and the numerator respectively. So since I want the numerator of my fraction, I'm going to say my fraction dot get numerator. So that's actually going to return 1 in this case. And so I want to multiply that. I want to multiply that by the denominator of my second fraction, right? So I can look right here. That's the denominator of my second fraction. So that means I want the denominator of, I just noticed that I named this fraction the same thing, so I actually want to call this user fraction. So I want the denominator of user fraction. So let's say user fraction. And remember, I want the denominator this time, so I'm going to call get denominator. All right. So far I just have this part right here. Now I want to add b times c. So in this case, b is going to be the denominator of the first fraction. So that's going to be the denominator of my fraction. So let's go my fraction dot get denominator. And then that's going to be multiplied by c, which is the numerator of the second fraction. So my second fraction is user fraction. So we're going to go ahead and say user fraction dot get numerator. Okay, so that expression is going to go ahead and calculate the numerator of those two fractions added together. Now we want to go ahead and calculate the denominator. So let's call this result den. So this one's a lot simpler. This is just b times d. So b is the denominator of the first fraction. So if we look at that, that is my fraction. So my fraction dot get denominator. There you go. And then times the denominator of my second fraction. So that's going to be user fraction dot get denominator. Cool. So now we have both the numerator and the denominator. What do we got to do? We actually got to create another fraction object using these two values. So they actually didn't put that in the comments. So let's go ahead and create another fraction object that represents the sum of our two fractions. So we're going to say fraction, and we can go ahead and call this result fraction. And then we got to call the constructor, so new fraction. And then we got to pass in the numerator and denominator. So in this case, we're going to use result num for the numerator and result den as the denominator. All right, the last step is to just print out the fractions as an equation. So you want something that looks like this. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to go ahead and say system.out.print line. Now, we don't have to print each of these separately because we have this Tostring method that actually returns it in fraction form, so numerator over denominator. So we actually just have to print out, we called it my fraction, and then we want to put a plus symbol, so we'll go ahead and concatenate that as a string literal. So concatenate, and then here's my string literal. Let's put spaces on either side. And then we're going to concatenate the user fraction, which is our second fraction. And then we need to concatenate an equal symbol. We'll put spaces before and after that as well. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and put the result fraction. Okay, so this is our entire print statement. So it should be my fraction plus user fraction equals result fraction, and it should result in something in this form. So let's go ahead and run that code. Oh, and we've got one small error. I just need the parentheses so that it knows it's a method. Cool. So let's go ahead and run that again. It's going to ask us for a numerator. So let's go ahead and put 1 over 2, so that'll add 1/2 plus 1/2. And it goes ahead and it determines that that's 4 over 4, which is the same as 1, so we know that's correct. And then we'll check the code. All right, and we can see that it passes all the tests for Tostring, where it prints out in fraction form, and it checks that we correctly print out the equation and that we actually use concatenation to get the correct solution. All right, so the last exercise is kind of a beast. So in this one, we are going to implement a class called Word Games. The class Word Games is going to have one instance variable, a string called word. And basically the purpose of word is to hold a string that's going to be manipulated via a few different methods that we're also going to implement. So one method is just a simple constructor that takes a string to initialize word. And then these three methods are actually going to manipulate this string word. So there's going to be a method called scramble that basically takes the first half of a word and swaps it with the last half. So for instance, if you have a word like turtle, it's going to be tolcher, which is weird. So we'll take a look at how to do that. And then we're also going to have these other methods called banana split. We're going to have two versions of these, and we'll take a look at what those do in just a bit. And then since we're getting into writing two-string methods, we're also going to be doing that as well. But let's go ahead and just get started with just one of these methods. Take it step by step. So I'm going to open up our class Word Games. And they've already created our private instance variable for us, and they've also already implemented the constructor. Actually, let me double check that. I forgot to reset my history. Okay, yeah, they've already implemented the constructor as well. I'm just going to go ahead and add those as comments. Constructor, it's always helpful to label your methods. So the first method that we want to implement is this method called scramble. And scramble, the purpose of this is, remember, to swap the first half of a word with the second half of the word. So if I have, a word like apple, for instance, that's going to become pole app. Okay, so it's going to switch the two halves. So I can actually do this in one line, but again, knowing that you're just starting out with programming and to be very clear, I'm going to do this in a few different steps. So my first step is to save the first half of the word to a string. And then my next step is going to be to save the second half of the word to a string. And then I want to concatenate the second half plus the first half. And again, if you're maybe a little bit more advanced, you can challenge yourself to figure out how to do this in just one line. But we're going to do it in at least 3 lines, just for clarity. Okay, so how the heck do I get the first half of a word? Or a string in this case. Let's go ahead and take a look at our Java Quick Reference. So if I look at Java Quick Reference, I know that I have access to a substring method that returns a part of the string from a beginning index up till an ending index. And then I also have another substring method that just takes part of a string from a given position to the end. So I'm actually going to wind up using both of these. So first let's get the first half. So I know I want to go from the beginning of the string, so the position 0, because we start at position 0, to the middle. Now you're probably wondering, okay, how do I know where the middle of a string is? Well, we're going to calculate that by taking the length of a string and dividing that by 2. So that's going to give us the middle point. So actually I'm going to add one more step here. I want to find the middle position of the word. Okay, and this is going to be stored as an int, right? Because positions or indexes are integer numbers. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and declare an integer. and let's just call it middle. And in order to find the middle position of a word, I'm going to call length on my string, and my string is called word. So I'm just going to say word dot length, and then again I want to divide that by 2. So this is going to give me the middle position of my word. So say I have a word like apple. Let's just use apple again. So this has a length of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 characters. So let's go ahead and just put that length is 5, right? And if I divide that by 2, length divided by 2, that is the same thing as 5 divided by 2, right? And in Java, remember that this is integer division, so it's going to result in an integer. So it's going to actually round down. So this is going to actually wind up being just 2. So it's going to go 0, 1, 2, and this is the middle of the word, right? We're going to be able to get the middle position that way. Okay, so we've got the middle position. Now we are able to get the first half of my string. So I want to just store that first half into another string. So I'm just going to call this first half. And I'm going to get that first half by calling substring on my string. And my string is called word. So let's say word dot substring. And since I want the first half, I want to start at position 0, which is the very beginning. And I want to go up to the middle. Remember, it's up to and not including. So it's just going to be, like if it were apple, it would just be the first 2 letters here. All right, so that's my first half. Now I want to store my second half. So string second half. So this time I want to go from the middle to the end. So I'm going to use the version of substring that only takes 1 argument. I'm going to say word.substring middle. So what this does is it takes the character at the middle of the string. So in this case, in apple, it would be right here, right? The 0, 1, 2. And then it'll go all the way to the end. And so it's going to store just PLE. Okay, so now I have my first half and my second half. Now I want to go ahead and I want to concatenate it in reverse order. Instead of first half, second half, I want second half, first half. So let's go ahead and say second half concatenated with first half. And I could store this into another string, but that's actually just what I want to return. So I'm not even going to bother storing it. I'm just going to return it just like this. Okay, so that's 1 method down. We've got 2 more and then a toString method to go. All right, so for this next one, this one's called banana split. And we are going to insert some text at a particular position. And the position is going to be determined by this argument right here, and the text that we insert is going to be determined by this string passed in here. So let's get some expanded information here from the assignment. So it says that we want to return a string that puts insert text in the word such that the first character of insert text is at index insert index. So let's take a look at an example. For example, if you want to put boo, so this is the insert text. So let's put that as an example. So this, say we call banana split, and we want to insert at index 2 the string boo into our word. And let's say that word is ghost. So our word is ghost, and we call banana split on our word. passing in the index of 2 and boo as the insert string, it's going to insert this string at that position. So let's see, here's 0, 1, and then 2 is where we're going to insert boo. So the result would be GH and then boo and then nost. So geboost would be the result there. So inserted it there at position 2. So we want to be able to do that for any word and any index. So for this, we're going to kind of tackle it in kind of the same way as up here, but instead of splitting the word in half, let's split it at the insert index. So let's go ahead and let's write out our steps. First, I want to save the first part. So it's not going to be a first half because it's not going to be split directly in half. It's going to depend on the index that we pass in. So save the first part of the string to a new string. Then we're going to save the second part to a new string. And then finally, we are going to concatenate, and that's going to be in the form of first part plus whatever the insert text is. So for example, boo or whatever you want to pass in, and then the second part. And that should get us the correct result. All right, so let's go ahead and work on this first part here. Let's create a string, call it first part. And again, we're going to use substring. So just like what we did up here. I'll actually just copy that. But instead of going from 0 to the middle, we're going to go from 0 to the insert index. And then down here, we'll choose something very similar. We're going to go from the insert index to the end. And we'll call this second part. Our last step is actually going to look pretty much like this. So we're going to return that concatenation of the first part of our string plus whatever we pass in as the insert text and the second part of our string. All right. Next method is going to be another form of banana split. In this case, we're not going to pass in an index. Instead, we are going to actually insert text after the first occurrence of a particular character that we pass in. So it's going to look very much like this, except we actually need to find out where that first character is. So we're going to have to find the position of insert character. So we're going to have to find that. And that's going to be a method that is going to be in our quick reference. Then we're actually going to do the same steps as we did above. So we're going to do save the first part of the word to a new string. We're going to save the second part to a new string. And then we're going to concatenate these things together. Okay, so how do we find the position of a character? Or in this case, of a string. Let's go ahead and look at what we have here. So we have something called index of that returns an integer. That is, the integer represents the index of the first occurrence of a string inside of another string. It's going to return -1 if that string is not found. So let's go ahead and go over here. So what I want to do is I want to declare an integer, right? Because that method, again, returns an integer that represents the index of the first occurrence of the string. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call that, let's just call it position. and I want to call index of on our string called word, so index of. And then in my parentheses, I actually want to put the string that I'm looking for. And the string that I'm looking for is called insert char. Okay, so that's going to give me the position. And let's go ahead and move that line to our underneath the comment that represents that step. All right, so now we're actually going to use this position to get the first part and second part of our string. So just like what we did, it's actually pretty close to what we did right here. We're going to go ahead and save a substring of our word from 0 until, not insert index, but position. And then the second part of our string is going to be from position to the end of the string. So it's just going to be the single argument version of substring, with the beginning position being position, and then it'll go to the end. It's called the second part. And now we basically just want to return this concatenation. So return first part plus insert text plus second part. Last part is going to be way simpler than those last three methods. All we have to do is return, and it looks like we just want to return the word surrounded by these brackets. So we're going to put the brackets as string literals, concatenate the word in between, and that's all we got to do for that one. Much simpler than what we did in the previous three methods. So now at this point, we can move on to the tester class, which they actually have not implemented fully for us. We need to ask for a word. So we'll use a print statement for that. So I'll just go ahead and put enter a word. Then we need to scramble it. So to scramble it, we're going to call the method scramble. And actually, before we do that, they didn't put this step here, but we need to actually create a word games object using the word from user input. So let's do that first. So to create a word games object, we're going to say word games. And then we can call it, let's just call it word game. And then we'll say new word games. And then remember that the constructor just takes a string. And what are we going to pass in? Well, we haven't even gotten the string from user input yet. So let's go ahead and store the string from user input. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this user word. And how do we get a string from user input? We're going to call the method called next line on our scanner object. So input dot next line. All right, so now we can use this string to pass into word games. And now we've created a word games object. Now we can actually scramble our word by saying user word dot scramble. Oops, dot scramble. So again, I'm calling this method right here. And then we want to actually print it out as well. So let's go ahead and we want to store this as a string so we can print it out. So let's just call it scrambled. And now we can go ahead and print it out. System.out.println scrambled. Okay, so next we want to ask for an index and ask for a random word. It looks like they've already done that for us. So it prompts the user, stores the number as index, then it skips over the new line so that we can store a string asks the user to enter another word, and stores that as a string called word. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to add that word at the index. So how do we do that? We need to call this method right here, banana split, where we enter an index and the text that we want to insert. So let's scroll back down. So I'm going to put this as a comment here so I know how to call it. I'm going to call this on our word game object. So it's called word game. So word game dot banana split. And then we're gonna go ahead and pass in the number the user entered, which we stored as index. And then we're also gonna pass in the text, the word that the user input, which is stored as word. And once again, we need to actually store the string that gets returned by this method call. So let's say string, and then we could just call this banana 1 since we're calling the banana split. And then I think we also need to print it out as well. So let's print that. And we're going to put banana 1. Okay, almost done. For the last part, we are going to ask for a character, store it as a string, ask for a random word, and then we'll do a method call to actually add that word at the character's position and print it out. 4 steps, very much like what we did up here. So we're going to, instead of prompting the user for an integer, we're going to ask for a character. So let me copy that and modify, enter a character. And then we're going to ask for a random word. Actually, we need to store the character first. Remember, it says store as a string. So we're going to say string. You can just call it a character. And then to get that string from user input, we're going to say input dot next line. Now we can ask for our word, and we can actually just copy this prompt right here. Okay, and then we want to store that string as well. So we're going to say string, I'll just call it next word, gets. And then again, we want to get the next line from our user input. All right. So here's the fun part where we actually get to call the method that we created. So we want to add that word at the first instance where the character appears. So the method we're going to call is banana split, but it's going to be the second banana split method that we created. That looks like this. So I'm going to go ahead and put that as a comment so I know the form. So I want to call on my word games object. So again, we called that word game. Word game dot banana split. And first I want to pass in the insert character. We stored that in a string called character. And then my second string, I need to pass in what text I actually want to insert. So for that, I called it next word. And then we also need to store that as a string. We can call this banana2. And then last step is to simply print it out. So system.out.println banana2. All right, so normally I wouldn't code this much without testing. So that's kind of bad practice, but I've kind of run through this already. So hopefully we don't have any syntax errors. Let's go ahead and run the code. Okay, we do indeed have something wrong. Variable user word of string type. So remember how this we're supposed to call these methods on an instance of the word games class, and I accidentally put user word here instead. I actually want to call this on my word game object. So let's go ahead and fix that. So wordgame.scramble is what I want. And we can go ahead and rerun that. So it's asking us to enter a word. I'll go ahead and put apple as per usual. And the first thing that it's going to do is it's going to call the scrambled method, which, if you recall, puts the second half of the word first and then the first half second. Now it's asking me for an integer. So this is, let's see, this is going to be the position at which it enters a word. So let's go ahead and do position 2, and I'll put banana. All right, so that is printing out the result of our first banana split method. So remember, what that does is it inserts a word at an index of our choice. So in this case, it inserted the word banana at position or index number 2. All right, next one, which is the last one, is we're going to enter a character. Let's see, apple has 2 instances of the letter P, so I'll enter P. And then I'm going to put in, this time, let's put pineapple. And so it inserted pineapple at the position of the first instance of the letter P. Let's go ahead and check that. And everything turns out great. So this homework was probably the most challenging thus far. And, don't feel overwhelmed if it was very, very difficult, because believe me, it's supposed to be. I would just, take my time. Don't be hard on yourself. You're in distance learning. It is going to be more challenging than if we were in the classroom spending 5 hours a week together instead of just one. So just take it one step at a time, and, rewatch the videos as you need to. Google things. Sometimes it helps to get things explained in a different way. And, good luck. It does take time to understand this stuff.